Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to our esteemed lecturer, Dr. Maslawati Muhammad. We are group number one and we are going to present on input hypothesis by Stephen Krashen. This topic will be presented by Ho Zin Yi, Ahmad Hamizan Lutfi Amir, Nurhanan Zulkifli, and Nurul Anisma Nasuha Irham. In this video, we are going to cover introduction, concept of input hypothesis, key types of input hypothesis, comparison of input hypothesis and traditional classroom, the relation of HOTS and input hypothesis, advantages and limitations, educational applications, practical classroom applications, and conclusions.
Now, I will be talking about the input hypothesis, a theory in second language acquisition proposed by Stephen Krashen. First, let's define it. The input hypothesis suggests that language learners acquire a new language most effectively when they are exposed to input that is slightly above their current proficiency level. This concept is known as I plus 1. Now, why is this important? This theory explains how learners naturally acquire language by focusing on understanding messages rather than rote learning or grammar drills. Here is a simple example. Imagine an English learner who already knows the words dog and run. If they hear the sentence, the dog is running, they can understand the new phrase is running because of the context provided by what they already know. Now, let's dive into the core concept of the input hypothesis. At its heart, this theory suggests that language is acquired, not learned. Acquisition is a subconscious process, much like how children pick up their first language. Learning, on the other hand, is a conscious process focused on grammar rules and structure. The most critical component here is comprehensible input or I plus 1. The I refers to the learner's current level of ability. The plus 1 represents the new language input that is just slightly beyond what they know but still understandable through context. The input must be meaningful and slightly challenging to engage the learner and facilitate acquisition.
There are other hypotheses besides input hypothesis by question. First, acquisition learning hypothesis. Language acquisition is subconscious and intuitive. For example, picking up a language through natural exposure, while language learning is explicit and rule-based. For example, when studying grammar rules, you should emphasize activities that promote acquisition, such as natural conversations and immersive environments, rather than over-relying on explicit grammar instruction. Second, monitor hypothesis. Acquired language drives spontaneous speech, while learned language functions as a monitor to correct errors. Monitoring is effective only if learners have time, know the rules, and focus on form. The implication: encourage spontaneous use of language while providing opportunities for learners to refine their output through gentle corrections or feedback, ensuring it doesn't overly inhibit fluency. Third, natural order hypothesis. Learners acquire grammatical structures in a predictable order, regardless of age or background. This process is largely independent of deliberate teaching. You should avoid forcing learners to master grammar structures out of their natural acquisition sequence. Instead, create varied exposure to language and let grammar acquisition unfold naturally. Next, affective filter hypothesis. Emotional factors like anxiety, motivation, and self-confidence influence language acquisition. A high affective filter, for example, high anxiety, blocks input, while a low filter fosters learning. You should cultivate a low anxiety, positive environment where students feel supported and motivated. For example, use praise and fun activities to engage learners while avoiding harsh criticism that may raise anxiety. What are the differences between traditional classroom and input hypothesis? The traditional classroom emphasizes structured, rule-based learning and control output, while the input hypothesis supports a natural, learner-centered approach where understanding comes first, fostering gradual and subconscious language acquisition.
How higher order thinking skills is related to input hypothesis? Number 1. Exposure to comprehensible input that challenge learners stimulates higher order thinking. When students encounter language structures at their I plus 1 level, they must analyze and evaluate the information to comprehend it fully. Number 2. Cooperative learning enhance input comprehensions and higher order thinking skill development by allowing learners to negotiate meanings and collaborate. Next, interactions among learners during language acquisitions offer feedback opportunities that enhance comprehensions and critical thinking. This support Krashen's view that interactions clarifies misunderstandings and deepens understanding. Lastly, educators should create environments prioritizing comprehensible input while incorporating tasks that require higher order thinking. This dual focus can lead to more effective language acquisitions and cognitive skill development. There's no perfect theories. Thus, input hypotheses come with advantages and limitations. For advantages, input hypotheses align with how children acquire their first language naturally. It also reduces anxiety by focusing on understanding rather than performances. Input hypotheses also promote long-term retention and fluency while encouraging meaningful language learning experiences. For the limitation, input hypotheses tend to neglect the role of output in language acquisitions. It also may not address advanced learners who need explicit grammar instructions and rely heavily on well-designed input.
Input hypothesis in educational applications. I'm going to highlight the key principles of input hypothesis. As we talked about before, input hypothesis proposed by Stephen Krashen is based on the idea that the language acquisition happens naturally when learners are exposed to the comprehensible input language that is just above their current proficiency level. This is referred to as I plus 1. Learners acquire language most effectively when exposed to language that is slightly more advanced than their current ability, but still understandable with context. This allows learners to progress without feeling overwhelmed. For example, for a beginner's for a beginner English learner, starting with a simple sentences like I like apples is easy to understand. As they become more proficient, they can handle more complex sentences like I like apples because they are sweet and nutritious. The gradual increase in complexity helps learners to internalize language patterns. Next key principles is acquisition versus learning. Krashen distinguishes between acquisition and learning. Acquisition is the subconscious. It's how we learn our first language by being exposed to it in a meaningful context. Learning, on the other hand, is a conscious, rule-based process where students memorize grammar rules. For example, engaging in authentic real-life conversations allows students to subconsciously acquire language skills, while memorizing grammar rules often doesn't lead to fluent communication. The third key principle is meaning over form. The focus of input hypothesis is on understanding and conveying meaning, rather than on strict grammatical rules. The idea is that language should be used in context to communicate, and grammar will improve naturally with exposure. For example, when students engage in discussions or listen to stories, they focus more on understanding the main idea or message, not worrying about every grammatical error. Over time, they naturally pick up correct grammatical structures through continued exposure. This theory supports the idea that language acquisition happens best when learners are exposed to meaningful, understandable language that challenges them just enough to encourage growth. Practical classroom applications. To apply the input hypothesis in the classroom, we can use activities that expose students to language slightly above their current level. For example, number one, storytelling and conversations. These activities expose students to language that's just above their current proficiency, helping them to acquire new vocabulary and sentence structures naturally. For example, a teacher tells a simple story, but gradually increasing sentence complexity to challenge students. Authentic materials. Using a real-world media like videos, songs, and social media content helps students to learn language as it used in everyday life. This includes slang and cultural references. For example, listening to songs or watching clips in the target language provides exposure to informal language. Task-based learning. Tasks that require using language in context promote communication and problem solving. For example, uh, planning a trip in the target language encourages the use of new vocabulary in a practical context. Highlighted practical context. Let's dive into a few more practical applications of the input hypothesis. Scaffolding with supportive language. Gradually providing support helps learners move from simple language to more complex structures. This bridges the gap between their current proficiency and the target language input. For example, the teacher starts with a simple phrases and gradually adds more complex vocabulary or structures as the students' understanding improves. Interactive peer collaboration. Encouraging students to work together on tasks helps them to use language naturally while processing input more deeply through peer interaction. For example, students collaborate on group projects in the target language, helping each other learn new terms and expressions. Last but not least, silent period. For beginners, the silent periods allows them to absorb language without pressure to speak. This phase is essential for processing language internally before they begin speaking. For example, a new learner may focus on listening and understanding during their first weeks without the need to produce full sentences. These strategies give students the right kind of input at the right time, helping them naturally acquiring language skills.
In conclusion, the input hypothesis is a theory by Stephen Krashen, emphasizes language acquisition through comprehensible input just beyond the learner current level, I plus 1. It suggests that language is best acquired naturally, like how children learn their first language through exposure to meaningful language in context. The theory also challenges traditional methods and promotes a more immersive, engaging approach to language learning.